Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simchat to the dagim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me. Simchat to the dagim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me. Yeah.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video Zoomcast, where we might not bring joy to the world, but we do talk about prophets like Jeremiah, and sometimes we even talk about kings.
Yeah, and today we get to talk about the wisest king of them all.
Yes, indeed, Rick. Today we get to talk about King Solomon and one of the most well-known stories in the entire Bible. But before we get to that, let's make our introductions. I'm Larry Herman, sipping some very fine wine. Today I've got some white Cabernet here. And talking Haftarah with my very good chaver, the king of cannellation, Rick Muller. How are you doing, Rick?
I'm doing great as always. I have my water here. I'm happy today because I get to tick off another box on my bucket list.
Bucket list? What did you do?
It's not what I did, but rather what we're doing. We've managed to get Rabbi-Cantor Chorny to join us, Hillary Chorny, to join us as guest on the show, something I've been looking forward to ever since we started these Zoomcasts. Welcome to our show, Rabbi Chorny.
It's good to be here.
Welcome, Rabbi. Or is it welcome, Cantor? Or welcome, Rabbi Cantor? Oh boy, I don't want to get in any trouble.
It's no trouble at all. Why don't you just call me your Royal Highness? After all, if Rick is the king of cantillation, then I can claim the title of Queen of Cantillation. How is that?
That works for me. How about you, commoner?
I'm not arguing with anyone. I'm just praying for a little wisdom. And speaking of wisdom, let's get right to our Haftarah, which manifests the great wisdom of Hamelech Shlomo, King Solomon. So I always wonder why we get nice narrative stories like this for Haftarah occasionally. They're few and far between, but they sure make for entertaining reading. But I wonder why this selection. The Eitz Chaim offers an explanation that the opening words of the Haftarah, Vayiketz, echo part of the intro of the Parsha. They're not actually the opening words of the Parsha, but the ending of the fourth verse, something that doesn't seem all that meaningful. Pharaoh, awakens, and Vayiketz. Vayikatz, sorry. And Shlomo awakens in the opening of the Haftarah. But this begs the question of how the first two verses of the Haftarah are connected to the main story at all. We'll read them in a minute, but it seems a strange place to start. In fact, if you haven't read or you don't have familiarity with the beginning of chapter 3 or the beginning of the entire book of Kings, it makes no sense at all. In fact, it's there at the beginning of the chapter that Shlomo asks God for an understanding heart to judge the people. Kind of like the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, don't you think? Mm-hmm. God tells him that since his request is not selfish, to have a discerning heart, God will grant him not only wisdom, but also unequaled wealth and honor, which is very convenient. And then comes verse 14, which starts our Haftarah, and is clearly an insertion into the epic tale by someone whom Alter calls the Deuteronomist, about walking in my ways and keeping all the mitzvot and yada, yada, yada. That's the end of the dream, which started way back in verse 5 of chapter 3, long before we're reading. And then comes the change of setting back to Jerusalem, because Shlomo wasn't in Jerusalem, and this has an entirely different meaning if you didn't know what had happened, because Shlomo had previously been sacrificing in the high places in Givon and not in Jerusalem, which to me seems like a no-no. And then boom, here comes the story of the two prostitute mothers. Why? Because it manifests the discerning heart and wisdom that Shlomo asked for, and therefore it justifies all of his power and wealth and honor, about which much of the rest of the first book of Kings is going to describe. Not really well connected to the Parsha, in my opinion, but a very fun read, don't you think? Either one of you.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
it's a great fun read. First of all, I love the narrative Haftarot too. It's a whole lot more fun, especially if you're not the one who's up there chanting. And I also love this idea that the categories of dreamer and dream interpreter are collapsed here. It gets so much more complex. Back in Miketz, we basically have two categories of people. You've got people who are dreamers, like the cupbearer who comes to Yosef, right? We have these two folks down in the jail cell with him, and he's the dream interpreter, and that's Yosef's role the whole time. But we've also gotten hints that he himself is a dreamer earlier on. He just becomes a dream interpreter as his role as in the entire book of our Torah progresses. And at first, what I love about this Haftarah is that we don't know what category Melech Shlomo is in. When we first see him in this moment, we don't know, is he going to be like one of these dreamers? Is he going to be like Paro, who has to get his dream interpreted and has to have someone come to him?
Yeah.
Is he going to be like someone who needs to go and consult Yosef? And it flips immediately because he's got this new discerning wisdom, like you said. And I like that. I like that it kind of messes with the categories because he is neither entirely empowered as a godlike sovereign like Paro, nor is he just a commoner, to use a word we've already said once today.
Great. So that explains why we have these first two verses introducing the story. Rick, what's your trope drash overview on this Haftarah today?
Okay. Well, the theory is to go for the rarest trope, to look for those and see what they tell us. So there's no pazers, but there is one zarka and one sigol. Those are the next two.
Don't they usually
rarest.
come together?
Yes. Sometimes they're separate, actually. The list that you gave me, there's 186 zarkas and 181 sigols. So there's 5 more zarkas in Haftorah land than sigols, because sometimes you have them doubled, which is really rare. But anyway, the zarka here, where did it go? Verse 26. So it's on Rachameha, that's the zarka. Kinich Maru in front of it is just a munach, it leads in. But the compassion, her compassion, al bana, is the sigol on her son. So if I didn't know anything else about the story, I would be able to say, well, there's something going on about compassion here, about her son. And there's a mapik in the hay that shows that it's her son. You'll hear that when I do it. So that's what I would start with, and then you go down the list. So there's Talisha. Oh, sorry.
For a second.
Yeah.
No, it's okay. Maybe it's telling us that the best part of wisdom is in fact compassion.
Yes, very good. Write that down. Write that down. Right. So you want to go on, or should we? Well, yeah, I should do so the structure that you helped see, because I didn't see it. Kadma v'azla, da-da-da-da-da-da, very dramatic. The 2 curves on top. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those, 6 of those, and they're high points in the story. I'll mention them as we go along. There's a Tilisha Ketana that looks like a little balloon leaning to the left. Those are high points. When the women speak, and it adds emotion, drama to the words, to what they're saying.
And I noticed you got a couple of powerful dargahs in there as well.
Correct. Yes. So Kadma v'azla is your favorite dargah. Tavir is mine. The whole Haftorah ends with the wisdom of God. Verse 28. Ki chochmat Elohim. It's the climax. It's the fireworks at the end. That this is proof that Solomon had God's wisdom and compassion, like you say. So that's about it for me.
Rick and Rabbi Chorny, before we start to chant the Haftarah, I do have a question. I noticed that the Haftarah starts with 2 munachs separated by a vertical line. I think it's called a munach legarme, followed by a pasik or pasek, and then another munach. And we've actually got, in verse 15, a double instance. We got 3 munachs in a row, each of them separated by a vertical line. And is there any special reason, any special interpretation of these munach, legarme, and pasiks?
Yeah. Have you talked about what munach legarme means on its own? What the meaning of that title?
Please do.
So munach legarme means it stands on its own. So munach is often conjunctive, right? It actually takes on the flavor of whatever comes next, which, as
links.
Rick knows, being a teacher of trope is the worst, right? Because you got to teach your students to look to the next word, both in Torah, Haftarah, and all the trope systems, to know what flavor the munach is taking on. So that actually has a musical connection to it being conjunctive. Munach legarme means a munach that stands on its own. So it makes it disjunctive. It takes it away from the trope that follows. And here, that means that each word winds up standing on its own, which is why I understand there developed a tradition of really taking a breath at the pasik or pasek. So we've got vayamod on its own.
Yes, and then lifnei.
Exactly. And then before, the ark, right? And so each word we're lingering on in its own notion. We do that anyway when we study text, right? We usually do try to linger on words, but here it's really telling us each word here stands on its own.
Right. And can I add on that? So the 2 phrases, the 2 sentences, verse 15 at the beginning, and then 26, there's only 2 in this story, right? It's Solomon doing something, and it's the rightful mother doing something. And when he's standing before the Ark of the Covenant, it's dramatic. You can picture him standing and then stopping, and then lifnei and stopping, and then he's there in front of the Ark. They could have described it any number of ways. He could have stood on top of it. He could have been a half a mile away from it, but he's right there, the seat of power. So then in 26, she's approaching him. Vatomer, she said, is the munach legarme, and then biadoni, please, my Lord. So it's like Larry mentioned to me before that they're bowing, they're being slow, they're being deliberate, that kind of thing. The women. Oh yeah. So vatavona, verse 16. Az tavona, they come down and they bow. The shtaim, the 2 of them, they bow before. So there's a lot of motion if you focus on it that way.
I think we should get right to the chanting now, and we can comment on each section as we normally do as we come to it. This week, I think we'll divide the reading a little unequally into 3 parts. The first 2 verses, which seem somewhat disconnected, although Rabbi Chorny helped to explain how they're connected now from the main story. And then we'll stop, and then we'll read the entirety of the story about the 2 women or 2 prostitutes who come to Solomon and his decision. And we'll stop before we get to the final verse of chapter 3, and we'll read the final verse of chapter 3 and the enigmatic opening of chapter 4 as our conclusion. So we're going to start with the beginning. Rick or Rabbi Chorny, any comments about the first 2 verses?
Well, we hit the Vayavo Yerushalayim, the big dramatic scene. Solomon comes to Jerusalem. There must have been fanfare and all that. You've seen movies. And then he's standing before the ark. And then the women approach, verse 16.
All right. So well, we're not reading that yet. So let's hear the first the bracha, and then the first 2 verses of the Haftarah.
Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Vayikatz Shlomo v'hinei chalom vayavo Yerushalayim vayamod lifnei Aron berit Adonai vayal olot Vayas shlamim, vayas mishte lechol avadav, az tavona shtayim nashim zonot el hamelech Vata'amodna lefanav. They stood like he stood.
That was interesting, Rick. So you started, maybe I made a mistake. You started with verse 15.
Yeah, that's what Eitz Chaim has, 15.
It does.
I heard you say 14. I thought you just made a mistake. You have a Chumash that has 14 first?
No, I probably just made a mistake.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's definitely 15.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
all right. So
And then
that-
Azla Geresh is the next word, very rare. The first one speaks.
That's right.
So yes, Rabbi.
I'm fascinated by one grammatical form that shows up twice in verse 16, but particularly the word it shows up on, just because this is a Haftarah-centered Zoomcast. I'll point out that there's this wonderful grammatical form for the feminine plural that ends in ona. So we've got az tavona, these
Yes.
two women came, and then ta'amodna. And by the way, ta'amodna can still be used in Gabaut for calling up multiple women. It's a revivification of that biblical construction of the word. But if you were to be in a community like ours where multiple people can be called up, I like to be a little bit wonky, and I'll call up two women by saying ta'amodna. I didn't steal it from this particular haftarah, but maybe I'll start thinking about this haftarah when I do that. This is an acceptable grammatical form. It's just considered archaic.
Yes.
Wow. That's interesting. So I'll ask then the first question about the second verse. Why are these women described as zonot, which we usually translate as prostitutes? So I haven't looked at any commentaries, but it would seem to me that this suggests that even the lowliest of people deserve the discerning judgment of the heart that Shlomo is going to give him. The first example of wisdom that Shlomo is showing is not to any elevated, rich, high, fancy priest or anything like that. It's to two, I'll say, lowly women who are engaged in a, what do they call it? The oldest occupation in the world. And they are deserving of the same sort of wise judgment from the king as anybody else. And they're in fact speaking directly to the king, which is also pretty impressive.
Yeah, not this advisor and that committee and then this one and then the king. They go right to the king. It's nice. It's nice.
I have a mundane and then like an elevated observation on it. The mundane observation is I think it's probably trying to set up a story that isn't complicated by having men involved.
Mm-hmm.
It's trying to separate out the women in their story. We see this in Shmuel Aleph with Hannah. We're sort of trying to create a dramatic narrative with Hannah and Penina. It's not completely foreign to later books in the Tanakh to kind of get this drama that's generated as best as possible by basically it's sociologically about women. It's about women's relations with other women.
And Ruth and Naomi too, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Ruth and Naomi really similarly. So we actually have a lot of drama that passes. What's the name of that? It passes the test. It's women talking about not men, right? At length, right? Narratively. The more interesting one is that the Zohar thinks that they're two demons. I can't really speak for why the Zohar brings that up. It's playing with the gematria of their names. It's not really all that interesting to get deeply into. We don't have enough time to get into the mythology of it. But I do wonder, because I like your observation, Larry, that this is probably about justice being meted out for everyone, including those who are in a lower caste, so to speak.
Fantastic. Why don't we go on and hear the entire story? It's very simple, very straightforward, and easy words. So if your Hebrew is at all, even if it's rudimentary, you can follow the story by just listening to the Hebrew.
Okay, so verses 17 to 27.
Yes.
Okay. Page 272. Did we say the page in Eitz Chaim? Page 272 now, verse 17. Vatomer haisha achat bi Adoni ani v'haisha hazot yoshvot b'vayit echad va'eled imach babayit. Vayehi bayom hashlishi liliti vateled gam haisha hazot va'anachnu yachtav ein zar itanu babayit zulati shtayim anachnu babayit vayamot ben haisha hazot Laila asher shachva alav vatakom betoch halayla vatikach et beni me'etzli. She took the baby. Vamarcha yeshena vatashki vehu bechekach bet benah hamet Hishkiva v'cheki va'akum baboker lehenik et beni v'hine met v'et bonein elav baboker v'hine lo haya v'ni asher yaladti v'tomer haisha acheret Lochi b'ni hachai uvnei chamet v'zot omeret lochi b'nei chamet uv'ni hechai vatdaberna lifnei hamelech. Again, the plural there. Vayomer hamelech zot omeret Zebni hachai uvnei chamet v'zot omeret lochi b'nei chamet uv'ni hechai vayomer hamelech kechu licharev vayaviu hacherev lifnei hamelech vayomer hamelech gizru Et hayeled hachai lishnayim utnu et hachatzi leachat ve'et hachatzi leachat v'tomer ha'isha asher benah hachai el hamelech ki nichmeru rachameha al benah v'tomer Bi Adoni Tnulach et hayalud hachai vehamet altmitu vezot omeret gam li gam lach lo yeh gezoru. And his answer, Vayan hamelech vayomer tnulach et hayalud hachai vehamet lo tamitu hi imo. Very short phrase there. You're muted, Larry. You're still muted. There you go.
Now I'm on. Okay.
Yes.
Wonderfully read. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
It's just, I don't want to jump in and step over all of your toes, but there's so many wonderful things in this reading.
Go ahead. I got shoes on.
And Rick, you've taught me a lot in terms of looking at the trope. And I just see so many things here. And one of them that I mentioned to you before was the use of the Rivi'i, which goes down, right? It's 4 notes going down. Mm-hmm. And it's, I think there are three or four of them here. And it's as if the characters are bowing in front of the king. In the first instance, I think occurs here on verse 16, is it?
Right. Where they both come. You said that. Uh-huh.
Right. They come in, they're bowing low. They enter and they're actually bowing. And then the other one that's very clear is at the very end, the plea of the mother, where we're so dramatically pleading to the king, and the woman with the Talisha Kitana followed by the Kadma V'Azla, Asher Bana Hachai. And that's the first time that we're really told for sure by the narrator that she's the mother of the living child, right? She claimed it at the beginning, but here we're told that she actually is. And what does she do? To the king, she bows down. Et HaMelech. It doesn't say that she bows, but the trope tells us that's what she does. She's supplicating herself.
Very nice. I like it a lot. Yes, yes.
I want to go back to that Zarqa Segol sequence in 26. Yes. I am fascinated by the vagueness of al-Binah. She had rachamim for her son, but it's not clear that it's the kid who's before them, right? It's not al-Hayalud. It's al-Binah. She had compassion for her son, regardless of the kid who's in front of her. It's playing with the vague possibilities of possessive, language that's their pronouns. Her son. She had compassion on her son. Maybe not this baby before, but out of the compassion for her son, she said, "Doesn't matter. Just don't kill a child."
Yes. Yes.
I have a question about the Dargah thing too.
Sure.
Have you looked to see if other trope systems in other parts of the world also go down on Dargah? Also have a downward motion with that music?
I haven't heard it differently.
So there are 23 common systems of trope across America between Ashkenazim and Sephardim, and those are just the ones that are sort of proliferated among different communities. Like that includes Chabad trope systems, and it includes these different variations of Sephardi systems. But there are many, many, many. You've got Taimani, you've got Greek, you've got Iraqi, Iran, and from different regions of Iraq. And I always think about how much we're in the drosh territory when we talk about going, using those motions going down, because those musical notes may or may not apply to other systems. Oh, sure. But I say may or may not, because maybe they also have a downward motion.
It's funny that you say downward motion, because though I'm not the trope expert, but when I think of a Dargah, I think about first going high. I always want to Dargah. Yes. So you're reaching for the heights, and it's very different for me from the Revi'i, which just is like bowing from the position you're in. Yeah.
It's fun to lane when there's two of them in a row, Dargah and then Revi'ah, right? Da 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 da. It's the whole scale. It doesn't happen here, but it happens. It happens quite often. It's kind of rare, but not so rare. It happens with a Dargah and then a Revi'ah.
Well, we all know the story, and we all know the wisdom of Solomon in his putting the two women on the spot, and both of them then revealing not only which one was the mother, but the true characters as well, in terms of what they decided to do. But Rick, why don't we chant the last two verses, and we can talk about.
Wait. But before, so then the wisdom of Solomon was not to kill, not to execute the wrongful mother, right? We talked about this. Right, remember? So I zoomed in on that they were alone, and it was 3 days after the first one gave birth. So there's no family, there's nobody else who could come to the first one's defense and say, no, that's my niece. I recognized her from 3 days ago when she was born. She looks just like her mother. It's a boy. But there's no support because they're alone. And that little piece of it is just sad that there's nobody to help the rightful mother. It all rests on Solomon, because nobody can prove that the son looked like the mother, or was any relatives or anybody involved. So it was weird to me that nobody else would know the story except these two people, but it says that they were alone. So it's not a trope thing, but it just it hit me that they were all by themselves.
It was a sad thing, and truly Shlomo had compassion for both of the women.
Yes, right.
All right. Rick, why don't you read the last two verses?
Okay. Vayishmeu Chol Yisrael et hamishpat asher shafat hamelech vayir'u mipnei hamelech ki hira'u ki chochmat Elohim bekirbo lasot mishpat vayihi hamelech Shlomo Melech al kol Yisrael.
Great. You know, Rick, I just noticed something you'll probably notice as well. The word vayir'u in that second to last verse, we were just talking about the verb yud resh ayin
In Rashi class?
in our Rashi class a little while ago. But here it's they held the king, they perceived the king in awe. In any case, so obviously the story is being told to the people, and they're impressed by his wisdom and by his discerning heart, right?
Yeah. It's a terrific description of it.
This is an interesting Judaic and Christian divide here as well, because as you can see, the way that the Christians decided to break up this story, verse 1 of the next chapter, which is a much later assigned, divvying of these stories, the Vayehi HaMelech, it becomes a therefore in this Haftarah. And therefore, based on this wisdom, Melech Shlomo deserved, obviously, to be king over all Israel in the eyes of the people, by the way, too, right? He needed this wisdom to be seen by other people. It's in our next chapter, in our next episode, is the way that it's divided by chapter. So it really does change the meaning to land on this verse and to let it be the conclusion to a story rather than the beginning of a new chapter.
That's an interesting comment that deserves more of a commentary perhaps in the future, is how we divided up the chapters, or not we, why did we accept the division of the chapters that the Christians gave them when so often they don't seem to make sense? But I would offer in this case an alternative explanation, because if you look at the end of chapter 2, there's a verse that says, "And the kingdom was unshaken in Solomon's hand." And this is just after he basically, I think he executes Adoniah, whatever he takes over power. And then we have chapter 3, which is what we're reading today. The beginning part is separate, as I mentioned, and then we have this story. And then we start at the beginning of chapter 4, or what should be the end of chapter 3, according to you, Rabbi Chorny, and Solomon was king over all of Israel. Kind of suggests to me that what was in between those two may have been just inserted, again, by what Robert Alter calls the Deuteronomists. But I'm no biblical scholar, so what do I know?
It's a great observation. It does seem to be a narrative departure from everything else that's going on.
Well, this was great. It's so wonderful to have you. We have to have you as a guest another time in the future, and maybe you'll give us some examples of those 23 different trope systems that you know about.
Yeah.
I'll go hunting to find out the story about how others are shaped. It's good fuel for looking into something that I've thought about for a long time, which is how our emotional and spiritual reaction to Haftarah is different because of the trope system in which we're experiencing it. And ours is our inherited Eastern European tradition is it's amazing. It's worthy of a whole Zoomcast of commentary because it has such interesting shapes. Others are a little less differentiated. So I think it's a good thing we have a pretty complex tradition, enough fodder for you guys to talk every week.
And it's a good thing that we have both the Queen and King of Cantillation will make it so lovely to listen to it as well. So that's all for this week. We wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. And it's not too late to wish everybody a Chodesh Tov, because today when we're recording is actually Rosh Chodesh and Hanukkah. And we'll see you all next week.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye. Have a good one. Thank you.